Hello and welcome to our latest installment in the Poetic Genius of. So today we're going to be taking a look at the poetic genius of Hakos Baelz. So today we're going to be taking a look specifically at the track Drown. So Drown was released on July 7th, 2023, and it is the second track off of the album Pandemonium. And it was written by Datinko and Martin Turabian. Apologize if I'm pronouncing those wrong. So, before we get into that though, I want to take a quick look at Paradise Lost. So, Paradise Lost is an epic poem written by John Milton between 1658 and 1663. We don't really know the specifics, so that's sort of just our frame of reference. It is sometimes confused with being a biblical text, but it's not actually biblically canon, so the imagery in it, etc., it's not actually canon. There are also many interpretations of this poem. For example, some people think it is pro-Lucifer and Satan, and other people think it is pro-Adam and Eve and God, etc. However, it is important to acknowledge that one major interpretation of it sees the whole text as being less religious and more as being a piece of anti-monarchy writing. So, during the time that John Milton was writing, there was, a great movement against sort of the crown of England, and sort of this whole movement with, viewing the crown as sort of almost being an icon and needing to do iconoclasm and all of that. So basically, some people interpret this poem as him using this sort of religious imagery to kind of sneakily get away with criticizing the king. So why are we discussing Paradise Lost now? Well, I believe that the song Drown shares similar themes and attitudes to the poem. So in the poem, Lucifer is cast from heaven after losing the war against God, and at first he despairs at his new home in hell. However, he eventually shifts this attitude. So let's take a quick excerpt at that moment. So in the moment he says, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But wherefore let we then, our faithful friends, the associates and co-partners of our loss, lie thus astonished on the oblivious pool, and call them not to share with us their part in this unhappy mansion, or once more with rallied arms to try what may be yet, reigned in heaven, or what more lost in hell." So with that being said, keep that in mind as we go through a close reading, but let's jump right into it. In order to make things a bit more organized, I'm going to try to be a bit more structured this time. So we're going to read the passage, then we're going to look for rhyme scheme, and then we will go line by line to identify metaphor, simile, imagery, tone, etc., which will then help us hopefully detect and sort of analyze theme. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. All right, so we start here with the first verse, which goes, "Descend again to this place alone. Enough's enough. Never wanted this." So if we get our green marker and we take a look, we'll see that there isn't actually a rhyme scheme going on here. These words are all their own. And that isn't important necessarily yet, but sometimes that can be an indicator of tone or sense of formality and voice. If someone is choosing to rhyme very structuredly, they may be going for a more formal vibe, more structured, rigid, etc. But if they're choosing not to rhyme, that can also mean sometimes we see, especially in the current day, that choosing not to rhyme can occasionally mean that you are trying to discuss something that's a bit more serious. If you were to be trying to write a poem about a horrible tragedy, for example, it could be seen as sort of like corny if you had it rhyming, at least to modern audiences. So sometimes, if someone is trying to handle a more serious topic, they may, at the very least, tone down the rhyming. But if we get over to our red marker and now we take a look at what's actually being said, we get descend again. So this already tells us a lot. The use of descend implies that you were once in a state that was higher up. You weren't initially at this lower place, you had to descend from it. And we usually see this as being negative. You level up in a video game, you rise up the corporate ladder when you get a promotion. You want friends who lift you up. A movie could be seen as uplifting. We see the motion of up being very positive, and we see the idea of going down as being negative. So not only do we know that there is this downward motion that has a negative connotation, but again, it's actually telling us that our main character of this song or poem started at a higher place. Then we get again, and this tells us that this is not their first time that they have descended. Now, what's interesting is that poses the question, are they descending again in the sense that they one time went down? Here, let me change my marker color. So, is it that they went down, then went back up to where they once were, and now they're descending again? Or is it implying that they descended once and thought they were at rock bottom, but then they proceeded to descend even more? The next line sort of answers this question by saying to this place alone. So this place is, specific, but also familiar. We get the idea that the speaker, the narrator of this poem, of this song, is familiar with this place. So I think it's the first option, in which they were once high up, descended, got back up, and now they've gone back to this place that they know a little too well. We also find out that they are alone. And so this isn't in a Paradise Lost way, Lucifer doesn't descend alone. He is joined with all the other fallen angels who assisted him in his rebellion against God. So here there's a loneliness, which also sort of informs us of some of the connotation of what this place may be. This place is a very negative place. And furthermore, it seems to be especially bad that they are alone, which tells us that it's the kind of place that you don't want to be alone. If you were to have, say, as a silly example, just to make it more simple, say you had a position at a job that you were low ranking on the ladder, and then you moved up to a manager position, but you didn't like that manager position and you didn't do well, so then you get moved back to your original position. You might see that as being a positive thing, so you wouldn't be saying, oh look, here I am, at being a cashier once again, all alone. You know what I mean? It's something more like if you were to be dealing with a mental health issue, or just to be in a toxic, bad environment again when you thought you got out of it, and to have to go through it alone is all the harder. There is sort of a sense of, resolve here with the enough's enough. Usually that's something you say when you're sort of, you've had enough of a sort of negativity or an antagonistic force, and you say, okay, enough's enough. I'm not going to take this anymore. And then we see that they never wanted this. Now, this is interesting too, because here one has to wonder, when they're saying never wanted this, that implies that they feel like they need to tell us that. In poetry and in songwriting, as I've said many times in this series, you get a very limited word count. So you're only able to say so much and so, few words. So you have to pick all of your words very carefully. There's also sort of an interesting concept of when a voice like this gives you information or seems to respond to something, you have to wonder why they're saying that. I hadn't been assuming that this person wanted to go back to this negative place, especially with everything else we just looked at. The usage of alone, the usage of again, enough's enough. So via that, I already knew that this isn't something that they see as ideal. However, by saying this, they're sort of revealing that there might be someone else in their life or in their situation who may be projecting onto them and saying, oh, you want this, or it's your fault, or something like this. And so our protagonist here is resisting against that and saying, no, this isn't something I wanted. I was trying to avoid descending again. So with that being said, let's jump right into the next part. So now we're in the pre-chorus, and once again, we are not seeing any obvious rhyme schemes, at the very least not at the end of each phrase. We are seeing some sort of internal rhymes with suffering and blundering. But beyond that, there's nothing major. There's sort of some sounds also with silence, please, words, suffering, and still. There's some S sounds, but there isn't a clear, A, B rhyme scheme or something like that. And so what's interesting about that is I think that sort of so far is leaning into sort of the idea of this being a protagonist or narrator or whatever you want to call it, they're exhausted. They've descended again and enough's enough, and they're sort of disillusioned. They're frustrated. So they're not really in the state of mind to be trying to do, let's say, witty rhymes or, kind of have a sing-songiness, because a rhyme in that sense, which is sort of what I was alluding to earlier, can also sort of add sort of a more happy sing-songy tone. So if you're rhyming, it kind of sounds almost like, an old nursery rhyme or something like that, especially, again, to modern audiences. So here they're saying, please, no more words, no more suffering and blundering. Silence is all I need today. Time be still. So here we're really getting, as this pre-chorus, a sense of just exhaustion and frustration and disillusionment. This really feels like the type of almost quiet before a storm. If you look at, people's psychology, when they start, asking for silence and just saying like, everything around me, please just stop and be silent. What it really is usually, indicating is that they're extremely overwhelmed. And as a result, they don't want the stimulus of any other conversation. They can't handle it. They're likely to, snap, lash out, etc. But also they're exhausted with the suffering and the blundering. They don't want any more of it. This is someone who's been through a lot. Silence is all I need today. Time be still. So in a sense, also by having silence be compared right to suffering and blundering, we get the impression that, at this point, anything that's breaking sort of silence is its own form of suffering as well, because again, they're so overwhelmed, overstimulated, they just can't handle anything more. There's also a sense of pleading with the please no more words. They're not declaring like, today there will be no more words. There will be no more suffering and blundering. It's not like this bold declaration of someone who is in power and in control. Instead, they're actually begging someone or something, please, no more words. Please, no more suffering, no more blundering. All I need today is just silence. So much so that even the passage of time is sort of adding to that sense of suffering and struggle. And they're saying, even time, please just move still. I can't handle the progress of time. It also sort of, with the time be still, and the fact that they've descended again sort of gives us the sense that perhaps this is something where they're sort of overwhelmed by the progression of time and they need to catch their breath. They've been through all this suffering and blundering and they just need time to be still for a moment so they can basically take a moment, reevaluate, kind of check in with themselves, process everything, and then move forward. So with that being said, let's move on to the next part. So now we get the chorus, which goes, switching off the lights, welcome in the abyss, sinking in despair but numb to the pain, covering my ears, the more the noise starts to hurt, I finally chose to drown. So here we're getting kind of a major revelation, which we'll jump into in a second, but to try to follow our structure we've laid out, let's take a quick look at the rhyme scheme. Once again, there's not much going on here. There's a little bit though. There's sort of an I rhyme here with the lights and abyss. They don't actually rhyme, but we get some of that S sound. And then with despair and ear, it's sort of similar, but it's not quite right. Pain starts, hurt, and drown do not rhyme though. So again, not getting a lot of rhyme. So then though, if we jump over here, again, if you remember that passage from Paradise Lost, we have this sense that Lucifer, he didn't want hell. He was trying to overthrow God and take over heaven and make his kingdom there. But he descends into hell by being thrown down there. And at first, it's a place of just suffering even for him. And, it's implied that it's sort of always a state of suffering. And he's sort of horrified by some of the things he sees. But at the same time, he eventually decides that you can either make a heaven out of hell or a hell out of heaven. And it's sort of like it all has to do with you. As long as you are yourself, you have that ability and that control. And here we sort of see some of that. So switching off the lights, welcome to the abyss. Saying welcome to the abyss already sort of has, almost in a weird way, a sort of positive connotation, though it could be sort of a ironic, sort of mock ironic, oh, welcome to the abyss, welcome to hell, that kind of thing. But there is also sort of almost, I'm getting a sense of, even in that irony, a sort of acceptance. Now, whether that acceptance is good or bad is sort of a discussion for perhaps a different video. But here we're just showing that we're starting to see that acceptance. They're sinking into despair, but they are numb to the pain now. Before, they were clearly not numb to the pain, and they were saying, please, no more pain, no more suffering, no more blundering, all of that. But this but does a great deal. And that sort of is like when there's a shift in a sonnet or other pieces, usually at the octave of sonnets, there's usually where it'll start with a premise and then there'll be a shift. So it sort of could be something like that, where it's like, I've descended again, I'm here in hell, I can't handle it anymore, but I'm now going to have this different attitude, this different change. So here they're numb to the pain. So in a way, they're sort of choosing to ignore the pain. It feels more active, this whole part, because they're switching off the lights. It's all written in active. It's not someone turned off the lights, someone said welcome to the abyss, they made me sink into despair, they covered my ears, my hands covered my ears versus I covered my ears. All of these verbs here are very active, which gives us a sense of some level of agency and control, even if it's an agency and control within their own suffering. So here they're almost allowing themselves to become numb to the pain, and in a way there's almost a sort of a growth there. Again, maybe a negative growth, maybe a positive growth, but there is growth. And once again, what's sort of interesting and something I want to kind of keep in mind as we keep going on is there's a large analogy, or kind of almost metaphor in a way, of noise being indicative of pain. Like the source of the pain seems to be noise. So what is that noise? Is it the voices of other people saying mean things? Is it the voices in their own head, intrusive thoughts? Is it like the voice of depression or anxiety or something like that? Or is it a more literal like noise, where again it could be just some other person who is antagonizing them, and that's sort of that antagonization is the noise because it hurts. But here we get sort of our Paradise Lost, Lucifer, sort of Byronic hero, anti-hero type thing, in which drowning is negative here. It's not something that you would want for someone. We don't want our protagonist here to be drowning, and because we know based on that first passage that descending is a negative thing for them. They don't like that they're descending. They didn't ask to descend again. But here they're choosing to drown. So there's something, this is sort of like the whole crutch of the Byronic hero and the sort of Lucifer. If one argues that Paradise Lost is sort of the character of Lucifer, not really the real Lucifer, but the character of Lucifer. If it's pro them, part of that is that they see that there is something noble and sort of honorable or respectable about choosing to drown. So it's sort of like here Satan is in hell, and that's actually something that's out of his control. He didn't retreat to hell. He was thrown into hell, and he's effectively a prisoner there. Now, he can choose to stay as a prisoner there and mentally stay as a prisoner there. Or he can choose to flip the narrative and make it that, no, I chose to be in hell, and I'm going to make hell my own heaven. Like, actually, this is good for me. And with the Byronic hero, there's also a ton of imagery. Usually it is choosing some sort of suffering or punishment. If you think about the romantic lead who doesn't get the girl and then walks off in the rain, and, it's very dramatic, and it's sort of like, no, he should have gotten the girl. It's not fair that he's suffering this way. And he's sort of like, I'll never date again. I'll never find another one, but that's fine. I'll always hold the memory of you. And, we see it as being like a very romantic and, again, sort of admirable trait. And so here we're sort of getting that with this whole concept of, well, if I'm going to go through this pain, if I'm going to go through this sinking, I'm going to say it's my choice. And by saying it's your choice, there actually is some power to it, because it's all in your head. It's all mental. Pain is mental. Everything is, it's sort of perspective. And even though you are still suffering, if you're kind of saying, you chose it, it can be honorable and admirable. That being said, though, there is the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is saying that you could be lying to yourself and saying that you're choosing it, or you could be choosing it for sort of self-destructive tendencies. So it's sort of difficult with what we've seen thus far to see if this is something where they're just being self-destructive or deluding themselves into thinking they're choosing to drown. Because if you think of like a non-Byronic one would be like someone intentionally getting themselves fired so that then they have no money, so that then they can't pay rent, so then they're forced to, be homeless and be in a terrible, and like it's truly self-destructive, and that usually comes from, sort of a hatred of oneself and sort of myriad of mental health issues. That's not the Lucifer thing. That's just self-destructive. The Lucifer thing is more like if your boss intentionally lied that you did something at work that you didn't do, and then you get fired, and then you lose your home, and everyone's lying about you, and you're sort of villainized, but then you choose to almost embrace that and be like, well, I'm going to make the best of the situation, if that makes sense. Sort of a lot to cover in just one, the poetics of it. And I think this is going to be a theme we're going to be seeing a lot in other future works, since Paradise Lost is one of the most influential pieces of writing. So that being said, let's jump into the next passage. So here we get our next passage, which goes, "In depths I find it's easier to breathe, spiraling down, how'd it come to this?" So once again, no big rhyme scheme here. Find, breathe, down, and this don't have any, clear rhyme scheme. However, to jump into the actual sort of, looking into the text of it, once again, we get this sense of depths, descending, going down, but there's also now the added sort of sense or connotation of depths being sort of water. So we get a drowning sense, because before you can just descend, if you're parachuting, you're descending even though you're in the sky, and there's not really a sense of drowning or breathing in that sense. You can descend a set of stairs, you can you can even like descend a slide, things like that. But if you're discussing it as depths, that's something we usually associate with, bodies of water and liquid and things like that. So what's interesting here is by using the use of depths, then this next part of it's easier to breathe is all the more interesting, because, to be, contrarian, if you were to say that if someone else was to be writing about, being on a mountain, and then they start to go down and they descend the mountain, it being easier to breathe doesn't carry that much weight emotionally, because it's harder to breathe the higher you go up a mountain because of altitude. But if you're descending further and further into a body of water and you're finding it easier to breathe, well, that's interesting, because it should be much, much harder to breathe because you're drowning effectively. Spiraling down, we also now have this image of this protagonist, sinking down and further into the water, and they're spiraling. It's a very like dramatic, beautiful, poetic image. So we have all of that. But what's interesting is then it ends on this question of how did it come to this? So here our protagonist is getting almost a moment of reflection, of looking at the sense of now they are sort of embracing this sort of descent and, this almost drowning in a way. And they're wondering how it came to this. And also, why is it easier to breathe? Is it easier to breathe literally in the sense that they, they're starting to believe that they do belong at this lower point? Or is it, again, them sort of being self-destructive and deluding themselves and claiming it's easier to breathe, but it isn't actually? Because that can also be a situation where if things are getting worse in life, it may feel easier at first because there's sort of like an acceptance of failure, where you're saying, oh, well, now that I don't have to worry about trying to chase my dreams because, my dreams are dead and I lost my chance of getting the dreams, it's easier because there's not that pressure. But that's kind of a lie. No one really means that. They're still mourning, the loss of their dreams and the loss of an opportunity, etc. So here, I'm very curious as to how true this statement is, and we don't really have enough here to truly get it, although Spiraling down again kind of has it's a beautiful image, but it's also still feels like a negative. If you spiral out of control, to be spiraling mentally, usually we consider those to be negative things. Spiraling out of control is not a good thing. So the use of describing it as spiraling down makes us still have that negative connotation to the action. And again, saying how to come to this, that seems to not be very satisfied. If you suddenly got a huge, nice new apartment and you got the best job promotion and you won $1 million, you wouldn't really use the phrase, how did things come to this? You would say, I'm so lucky to be here, or how did things go so well? But instead, if you suddenly lost your apartment, had a breakup, lost your job, lost your dog, classic blues music, you would eventually then look around and be like, oh my gosh, how did things come to this? How did it get to this point? It's sort of an exclamation of disbelief at how basically bad things are. So, but also it could be sort of seen as a bit of sort of looking at yourself with some degree of shock and saying like, wow, how did I get to the point where it's easier for me to breathe? The further into the depths I go, the further I spiral down, it's easier for me to breathe. How did it come to this? How did I become this way, let's say? So let's jump into the next passage and see if we can get a little bit more information. So now we get the passage, lies, endless maze, endless struggling, no escaping, locked away all my fears within, all is still. So this is once again sort of a huge revelation. No rhyme scheme, just to get that out of the way, but hereby we kind of realize sort of how they're coping. And now we know they're coping a bit through unhealthy means, let's say, but we still don't know if that is putting them sort of on the Paradise Lost, Lucifer anti-hero side of things, or in the just purely self-destructive side of things. And so the part I'm mostly discussing here is the locked away all my fears within, all is still. So we know that they wanted stillness, but how they got it is sort of negative. We don't tend to see locking away your emotions and your fears as being a positive thing. If anything, you should talk about it with, a friend or a therapist or someone trusted. Process it. Don't deny it. By locking away, you're sort of ignoring it, but it's not actually going to go away. And so you're ignoring a problem that is progressively getting worse the longer you ignore it. That being said, since they chose to specifically only say that they're locking away their fears, it's a bit more complicated because to a degree, locking away your fears can be a good thing because you can't let fear dictate your life. If it was locking away all of my pain within, then it would be seen as totally negative because you shouldn't really bottle up your emotions in that sense. Or if they said locked away all my feelings within, all of those would be definitely negative. But in theory, if you're just locking away your fears, it's a bit more up in the air as to how negative that actually is, which seems weird to say, but it's kind of true, because, if you were afraid of skydiving and you're about to skydive, in theory, it's actually good to lock away your fear of skydiving because then you can still make the jump. So it sort of depends on the context. And obviously, in this field, context is everything. But to look at this opening part, we see that there's lies, endless maze. So they're in an endless maze of lies. So that's interesting because now we're getting that maybe the noise from earlier that seemed to be, harassing them so much may have been lies about themselves, which we still don't know technically if it's the lies of other people who are, spreading lies about this protagonist, or if it's the lies they're telling themselves, because you can lie to yourself and say negative things about yourself that aren't true, etc. But to be in an endless maze is also interesting because, that's its own situation that's we usually think of being as separate from drowning or going into the depths. I don't know about you guys, but I tend to picture mazes as weirdly being on a sort of flat surface. Corn maze, I don't know, Greek mazes, Colosseum mazes, things like that. Usually it's all flat, one surface, and sort of just stretches on and has an extremely complex network of, like hallways and walls and stuff. But there's not really that depth level. But then we get endless struggling, no escaping. There's no escaping this maze of lies. That seems to at the very least be their attitude. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, because this could be an unreliable narrator. And in that sense, sometimes we think of unreliable narrators as the narrator is intentionally lying to the audience. But an unreliable narrator can also be a narrator who just doesn't actually have the full information, so they're accidentally telling us incorrect information. So if the narrator truly believes there's no escaping this maze, there's no way out, that could be unreliable. Or we could be witnessing a protagonist who's sharing a story with us of a situation in which there is no escaping. Because this is a piece of art. It doesn't have to necessarily reflect reality. I want to be optimistic and say that there is a way to escape endless mazes in real life, but maybe in this scenario there isn't one. Or they could be, again, using artistic license, because they're ultimately comparing, sort of as a metaphor, their maybe mental suffering, the mental maze that they're in, as being inescapable. So it's like, if you were to say, oh, how bad's the situation for you? And you were to say, it's like an inescapable maze, an endless inescapable maze. Then it's like, that conveys the idea, that conveys your situation, that, paints the picture. So what's also interesting, though, is that it's not endless suffering, it's endless struggling. Now, struggling is, a word that has a negative connotation. If you're struggling in school, it's seen as, you're not doing very well with your classes, you're having a really hard time with your homework. But at the same time, we also can see struggling as being sort of a noble effort, in that, you're struggling against a unbeatable enemy. So here we have that there is an endless maze that has no escape, but if you're still struggling to get out of that maze, there's something noble about that. You're still trying to get your way out. Because again, it's not endless suffering, it's not endless losing, it's not endless failure, it's endless struggling. And there is something noble to the struggle against oppression, against the endless maze, against mental health. Or mental illness, I should say, I guess, in that context. So you see what I mean? There's something very kind of confusing, but in an interesting way, about this protagonist. It's very hard to tell if they're telling us that they're struggling nobly, and endless struggling against a maze where there's no escape, or if they're trying to just say, like, oh my god, day after day, it's just endless struggling. I never get on my feet and properly get like a flow going. I'm always struggling. Like if someone told you that they were always struggling with homework or with courses or with tests, you would get the idea that like things are not going well for this person. And in that context, it's not very noble. So let's look at the next passage and continue to see if we can get a little bit more information about our narrator and their attitudes. All right, so now we get the next chorus, which says, "Reach into the dark, come lie in the abyss. Contract signed and sealed, one cannot be free. Opening my eyes, overflowing tears, oh, they taste so sweet. It's easier just to drown." So, before I get into it, no rhyme scheme here that's very obvious. There's a bit of a rhyme with free and sweet, but they're far enough away that I don't think that's like an intentional rhyme. But to get into the sort of meat of this is getting all the more difficult. So, is this a Paradise Lost situation, or is this a self-destructive situation? This is going to be the question we're really, grappling with throughout this whole analysis. Because here we get contract signed and sealed, which is certainly channeling the idea of making a deal with the devil. So we're getting devil imagery here. you get your deal with the devil, you sign a contract, and when it's signed and sealed, there's no going out of it. One cannot be free of this. And they're now all the way in the dark, and they're lying in the abyss. What's also interesting is if you lie in the abyss, it's almost like you're at the bottom, because in order to lie, you have to be lying on something. So if you're lying in an abyss, it's almost like you are truly now at this point at true rock bottom. They've hit the bottom of the abyss, and now they can like lie in it. They make this contract, but then they open their eyes, which normally is a positive thing of they're getting some sort of truth. Usually, if you open your eyes to something, that image of opening your eyes is normally where you get a revelation. Oh, I opened my eyes and I finally saw that my relationship wasn't good, or that opened my eyes to realize that the company I worked for was a bad company. That kind of thing. It's like this sense of you get a revelation. But here, when they open their eyes, instead they get overflowing tears. But the tears taste sweet. It's easier just to drown. This is such a difficult stance to sort of penetrate and understand. I don't know how much we're supposed to be like listening to our narrator, our protagonist. Are they lying to us when they say it's easier to drown, in the sense of like, is this them triumphantly saying like, oh yeah, in my tears I may be crying, but they taste sweet, and honestly it's easier to drown? I think the just here is what's throwing me off, because just is usually sort of used as sort of a unsatisfied sort of sense. So if what do you have for lunch? Oh, I have just this sandwich. That's not them saying they have enough food. That's them saying that they're unsatisfied with how much food they have. So then you say, oh, just a sandwich? Yeah, I wish I had chips and a drink. You know what I mean? Or, oh, what did you get for Christmas? Oh, I just got socks. That just is usually a word that is telling us that it's not a good thing, that it's sort of them being, oh, well, oh, what do you do for work? Oh, well, I just sort of open the door and then check the cash in the cash register. That's not someone who's like proud of their job. That's not someone who's, flexing their job, unless they're flexing it as like, oh, my job's so easy. But then you usually get that context. But saying it's easier just to drown implies like, oh, well, there's two options here. There's either to swim up or you could drown. And ultimately, well, it's easier just to drown. I don't think that's them actually believing that. I think that's almost like a cry for help in a way. I think they're crying for help. Because otherwise you would say like, oh, well, I like it down here. Or, oh, well, why are you drowning? Well, drowning is actually the best route. Drowning is the best thing you can do. Drowning is where I was meant to be. No, they're saying, well, it's easier. So I'll do it because it's easier. And doing something because it's easier, especially with all this epic imagery of darkness and abyss and signed contracts, normally we don't see the easier path as being the noble, honorable hero path. Because, say, a hero is given a sword and told to slay a dragon. Well, it's easier just to run away from the dragon, but we don't really applaud that. The hero runs away. We're going to be like, what? The hero didn't slay the dragon? Well, it's easier just to run away. So I think here we're seeing more of the self-destructive acceptance. I think we're seeing someone who is suffering a lot. They're lying in an abyss and they're in the darkness and they feel like they can't be free. They feel like they've made a contract that they've signed and sealed. They can't get out of it. And when they open their eyes to the revelation, they taste their sweet tears and it's easier just to drown. I don't feel like that's really like, oh, I love the taste of my tears. They taste so sweet. It's really like more of a bittersweet thing. Because the tears are overflowing. Why else would they be crying that much? So it's sort of interesting is that I really think this is much more the sense of this is someone who is trying to accept their situation, but kind of lying to themselves. Because the Lucifer thing, it's kind of tough because in Paradise Lost, Lucifer kind of is also coping. Because he says you can make a heaven of hell, or a hell of heaven, But is that just kind of him telling himself that? Is it true? This is the fun thing about poetry, is one has to constantly be asking, like, is what I'm being told true information? Can one make a heaven out of hell or a hell out of heaven? Because that quote is often, kind of celebrated as sort of like almost like good life advice in a way, where it's like, oh, well, don't, it's usually used in the sense of like, don't complain. If you're like, oh, my job sucks, my apartment sucks, and my girlfriend left me, it's sort of like, well, yeah, dude, don't complain about that. Like, it's all in your own perspective. It's all in your mind. You could act like all of that's hell, but you could also act like it's heaven. The person's like, what? How am I going to act like that's heaven? Well, look at the brighter side of things, or just be like, you know what? This is exactly the apartment I want, even if it's not the apartment you actually want. So it's very complicated. There's like, it's all about psychology of if you're lying to yourself, or if you are telling the truth, if you are being positive, or if you're just falsely being positive. And if you're falsely being positive, you're not really being positive. So yeah, this is a dense song. This is a hard one to truly like annotate and get to the bottom of it. But let's look at what the next part says and see if we get any more revelations. So now our next passage goes, "Let me fade away. Hope is long gone. No such miracles to save us all. Only way out I know is here. Drown with me." So things are getting very, very interesting. No rhyme scheme here, but here we're kind of getting the Lucifer Paradise Lost vibe now, and we're getting a conversation. This line, "let me fade away," this is the protagonist talking to someone else. And by saying "let me fade away," it's implied that the other person is saying, no, get out of the abyss, rise up, don't fade away. And they're saying like, leave me alone, just let me fade away. In a way, saying "let me" is once again sort of asking for approval or permission. This protagonist feels like they need permission in a way, and they're saying, hey, if you keep trying to get me to leave the abyss, I might leave the abyss. But I don't want that. Maybe for self-destructive reasons, maybe not, but I don't want that. So please, just let me fade away. Just let it happen. Don't resist it. And you wouldn't say that if you thought it was for sure. If you thought, oh, well, no matter what they do, I'm going to fade away, you wouldn't have to say "let me fade away." You'd say like, oh, I'm going to fade away either way. But instead they're saying "let me fade away." They're choosing it in a way. Whether it's good that they're choosing it or not is up for debate. But they are choosing it, and they're telling someone else not to save them. But then we get "hope is long gone. No such miracles to save us all." This is now becoming more Paradise Lost, because we're getting "us all," which is almost like Lucifer and all of his other, devil friends who are the fallen angels. Only way out I know is here, so drown with me. There's suddenly this entire sense of like conversation of multiple characters. Everything else felt like this person was alone in all of this. They even said, "I'm back in this place all alone." But now we're getting it, no, drown with me. And the thing is now they're encouraging others to follow them. And you know who also does that? Lucifer in Paradise Lost. But again, it's so important to remember, Paradise Lost is not a biblical text. So this is not necessarily saying this is the devil trying to sway people in a bad way. It could be a call of rebellion in its own way. Because with Lucifer and his fallen angels, they don't view this God who is omnipotent and all-powerful and all-seeing and totally oppressive. They view him as oppressive. They don't view it as a good thing. So, is the protagonist here sort of doing a rally call of sort of saying like, come drown with me, like together we will all go into this new era? And it sort of is like there's a level of rhetoric to this. They're trying to convince. They're writing argumentatively. They're saying like, well, hope is long gone. There's no such miracles to save us. Like, don't even try to cling to hope. The only way out I know is to just stay here. So, stay here and drown with me. There's like an acceptance, but there's trying to bring other people with them. And there's sort of like I said, they're trying to convince others now, as well as convince themselves. And here at the final chorus, we get silencing all sound, welcome to my abyss, nowhere else to go, a prisoner of fate. Someday you will stand, but those words are empty and void, all lies. They told me to go and drown. So this is really interesting because we've gotten a complete change in personality, really. So now we get total attitude change. Now it's my abyss, which means that they've come to accept their current stance. Silencing all sound, welcome to my abyss. Now it feels like, so the abyss is silencing all the sound. Is the sound negative? What's going on here? They have nowhere else to go. They are a prisoner of fate. So once again, though, there's sort of an acceptance, but also sort of a sense of powerlessness, because they're saying that this is ultimately their fate. They didn't choose to drown. They're a prisoner of fate. But we saw during that sort of resistance and the bridge and all of that, that there maybe could have been a chance to leave it, but they chose to believe that this is their fate and they had no way out of it. Which also goes into the whole Paradise Lost thing, because a big part of Paradise Lost is, do we truly have free will? Because, like, did Lucifer have free will? Or was he made to be a fallen angel to then one day tempt Adam and Eve? Like, is that his nature, and is that, like, out of his control? Or is he truly just choosing all these different things? Someday you will stand. You is someone, obviously not them. So they're saying to someone else, someday you will stand. But those words are empty and void. So you may stand, and to stand versus lying in an abyss. So it's to stand is to rise up again. It's to ascend, not to descend. So someone's going to try to stand, but this protagonist, when that happens, they're not going to believe him. They're not going to see it as hope. They're not going to see it as a chance out. They're going to see it all as empty and void and as a lie. They told me to go and drown. This has a bitterness to it. This feels like, we saw this protagonist in the beginning who's descending, who has all this noise, and they're trying to silence it. They're suffering, they're blundering, they're struggling against all of this. But the noise might have been people telling them to go and drown. Oh, go drown, go drown, go drown. And like, fine, okay, I didn't want this, as we saw in that first verse. They didn't want it, but fine, I'll go drown. And now they're bitter about it, because now they've drowned, and now they're in an abyss that they're now proceeding to call their own home. They feel like they have nowhere else to go. They feel like they're a prisoner of fate, but they still have a sense that someday someone else is going to stand. But when they do stand, it's going to be empty and void, all lies. I'm not going to go with you. They have fully come to terms with their new state of being in this abyss, and they basically have no interest in leaving anymore. And now we get our outro, which states, so let's fade away, let all disappear, leaving behind nothing. So here, with the acceptance, there seems to be a true acceptance. There's no sense of, maybe I'll leave. Maybe someone else will stand up. There's nothing. It's just so, which sort of has a resigned tone to it. So let's fade away. Let all disappear, leaving nothing behind. Nothing. But interestingly, the nothing is in quotes. But yeah, so here they're saying, let's just fade away. They've totally resigned themselves. But there's also, again, there's a further destruction. By resigning to it, there's more destruction in that now it's saying, not just I'm going to fade away, let's fade away. Let's have everything disappear, and let's make sure we leave behind nothing. No legacy, no memory, nothing. And so, yeah, this one ends on a pretty negative note in a sense. Again, it's tough because you could maybe see this as being a sort of Byronic hero who's saying, sort of in a weird way, triumphantly, like, let's fade away, let it all disappear. Sort of that whole, like, let it burn. It's like, I'm going to, at the very least, feign indifference. But we don't know if that indifference is true or not. But at this point, I don't think they know. I think at this point, they believe it. Because we saw some resistance before, some mentioning of suffering and all this. And this seems to be, again, like full acceptance, where maybe to them, they're not feigning it anymore. Maybe they really are indifferent. Because all they want at this point is to fade away, to disappear. But then you're still left with this, but why? Was it because this is someone who tried to, like, go out and get involved with society, make friends, etc., but everyone was just so mean to them and told them to go drown, go away, get out of here. We want you to suffer in a way. And so at first they started to suffer and they didn't like it, but they saw that no one was coming to save them, and so they began to believe that this was their home, their abyss. They say it's my abyss, and now they're here and they've just come to fully accept it. But if they're accepting it, maybe there's something noble about that, maybe not. It's hard to say. So yeah, that's going to wrap up this, latest episode of The Poetic Genius of. So if you enjoyed this one, please consider subscribing so you can be notified when more of these come out. And, if you could leave a like on the video, that would mean a lot. So what are your thoughts on this song? Do you agree with my interpretation? Do you disagree? And if so, why? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading through them. I love hearing your thoughts. Sort of my favorite part is now we get to have a true discussion and have some discourse. And so I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any ideas of other songs or pieces of media you'd like me to take a look at through this sort of filter, please let me know. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care, and I will see you in the next one.